Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Dr. Lee for inviting me to speak at the POTS this year. I will be giving a bit of a European perspective on palm oil, in particular the challenges here with saturated fat in food. So, in Europe, for consumers, health aspects of fat have become very confused. People are not entirely sure what they should and should not be eating. They know that trans fats are bad for their health, so they are looking to avoid anything that says hydrogenation on the label or hydrogenated fats. So they pick up a packet of margarine. If it says hydrogenation on it, it's rejected and they will go for something else. They know to avoid saturated fat. They've been told for many years that saturated fat raises cholesterol and that leads to heart disease and strokes. So they're looking for low saturated fat. They've been told to go for polyunsaturated fats. And so they've switched to using margarines with sunflower oil and even cooking in sunflower oil. Then they've been told that cooking in highly unsaturated fats like sunflower oil is not good because they oxidize. And so they're looking for things which are only monounsaturated, like olive oil. So it becomes very, very tricky for a consumer to know what to eat. Even last week in the Times in the UK, there was an article reporting on a lecture given by Karen Michaels from Harvard University, who said that coconut oil is pure poison because it is so high in saturates. But consumers have been told by celebrities like Angelina Jolie and Gwyneth Paltrow that coconut oil is fantastic. Just eat it by the spoonful. So consumers are confused. But I think also maybe this Harvard professor is also a little confused because coconut oil is high in saturates, but they're medium chain and short chain, medium chain, and they're metabolized in a different way to the longer chain saturates. They have a different impact on health. So consumers are not quite sure what to do. And on top of that, there are all sorts of environmental concerns that they're informed about with palm oil. And then you have companies like Iceland in the UK that say we will not use palm oil in our products in the future. We're going to take palm oil out of all of our products. So it's very tricky. When you add on top of that you must also reduce salt and you must reduce sugar, consumers wonder what they can eat. Then they are informed there are different sorts of unsaturated fats, liquid oils, omega-6 and omega-3, and you need to get the right balance. So we understand something about this, but consumers get very confused. So that creates a challenge for us in formulating foods to sell to consumers, how we sell them to them, and how we give them the right nutritional properties, but also the right properties in the food themselves, the right characteristics. So let's have a look at the need for saturated fats, because there is a need. I'm sure that many of you are quite familiar with this, but I thought it might be helpful to run through a bit of the background. This is a saturated fatty acid. Actually, it's one of the saturated fatty acids you would find in coconut oil with 8 carbon atoms. But you get octadecanoic acid. This is a saturated fatty acid you would find in other oils. There is some in palm oil. Palm oil itself has, of course, 16 carbons in its saturated fatty acid mostly. But what we need to think about in terms of formulating foods is not just the fatty acid composition. That's a fatty acid molecule on its own, but in an oil, it's in the form of a triglyceride with 3 fatty acids on glycerol. And it's the identity of those 3 fatty acids that determine the properties of the oil, of the fat. So if all of those fatty acids are unsaturated, you will have a totally liquid oil. If they are all saturated, so with palmitic, for example, then you will have something which is rock hard. If one of them is unsaturated, you have something which is melting at around body temperature. If 2 are unsaturated, you have something which is melting around room temperature. So it's not simply fatty acids that we need to think about. It's the triglyceride or the triacylglycerol that we have to think about in terms of formulating a product. It goes further. You can get different crystal structures in fat. So this is a triglyceride again. But within the solid, they will pack together to give you different structures. I'm just going to flip through this quickly. So the triglyceride molecule can pack together in different ways, and each of those different structures give you different properties. So when you come to design a product, you need to think about the processing that's going to be applied to the product, as well as how it's going to be used in practice, how it's going to be stored and handled by the consumer. And so you're looking for particular crystal forms of the triglyceride. Now here, you see from the lamella at the end where the triglycerides pack together, how it impacts the structure on the bulk fat. So I'm a scientist. I think in terms of properties of the molecules and how they interact, but how they interact leads to the bulk property in the fat and or the oil that you're going to be using. And of course, in a fat-based product, that has an impact on the properties itself, whether it's a baked product or a margarine or a chocolate or an ice cream. It all comes down to the molecular properties and the saturated fat or not that may be present. There's all sorts of applications which you're all aware about, and so many of those are critically dependent on the composition of the triglyceride, and that is dependent on the saturated fatty acids present, as well as where those fatty acids are in the triglyceride. Frying is slightly different. There, our concern is more for oxidative stability, as well as the product at the end. With confectionery in particular, it can be critical, the structure of the triglyceride, but in frying, it's more down to oxidation. If we were just looking at spreads, margarines, there's a wide range of properties that are required depending on the application. You've got a very soft tub. So look, oh, it's a very tiny pointer. The bottom line there is for a soft tub margarine, very spreadable, direct from the fridge. But you go up to a pastry margarine, which has a much higher melting point, a much higher melting profile. And there's all sorts of profiles in between. So again, if we're looking at a food product, we're saying, what is it going to be used for? What properties do we need? What melting profile do we want? And then as a scientist, I go back to say, okay, so what composition do I need in the fat to be able to achieve those properties, the melting profile that we would need in that particular application? I mentioned confectionery. This is for, if you look for cocoa butter equivalents, there can be a range of properties that you'd be looking for there. Cocoa butter is there in the at the bottom there, but you can take palm mid fraction, You can take a stearin fraction from shea, and together you can make CBEs. But there are a wide range of CBEs that you want. You can use those to adjust the properties of your cocoa butter and your chocolate. You can increase the melting point. If you have something that tends towards the shea stearin here, you end up with something which is an improver in the sense that it increases the melting point of your chocolate. But what you see is that we want quite different properties to those that we want in a margarine. In a margarine, you want a much flatter line than we do with a CBE. We want something that melts sharply. So for a margarine or spread, you want something that has structure. You want it fairly firm in the fridge. When you come to spread it, it wants to be relatively spreadable. When you eat it, you don't want it to be hard, but you still want it to have some structure. With a CBE, you want it to melt only in your mouth, not in your hands. And so you want a very sharp melting point. Now, if we look at triglyceride melting points, these are fully saturated triglycerides going from 12 carbon, C12, up to 22. And you can see there's as you increase the length of your saturated fatty acids, you get a higher melting point. If you look at the effect of unsaturated, simply taking the center position of the triglyceride and replacing the saturated fat with a monounsaturated oleic acid, or a double unsaturated linoleic acid, or a triple unsaturated linolenic acid, you can see that the melting point comes down. If we look at increasing the number of unsaturated fatty acids, again you see that as the unsaturation increases, the melting point comes down. And if we look, for example, at the effect of chain length or saturated fatty acid chain length with a single unsaturated chain, you'll see that, again, chain length influences the melting point by increasing it as the chain length increases. What that means is you can design a product to have whatever melting profile you want by selecting the particular triglycerides you want. But the important point is that if you want some structure, you have to get it from having saturates in there. If you have unsaturated fat present, if it's all unsaturated, as in the bottom left hand here, if you've got OOO, which is all monounsaturates, no saturates, the melting point is around about 5. It's liquid oil. That's no good for chocolate. It's no good for confectionery. It's no good for baked goods. It makes them very greasy. You need some structure. On the other hand, if it's fully saturated with the melting point above 70, that's no good for eating either. That's like eating a candle. It's rock hard and it's very waxy. You don't want to eat that. So we're looking for somewhere in between with one unsaturates or two unsaturates. And it so happens that palm oil is characterized by having many of those triglycerides in it, of POP and POO, which are just ideal for working in that middle area. And so by looking at controlling the proportions of those, you can control the properties that you want in a product. I mentioned oxidation and how with frying, oxidation is an important issue. If we look simply at relative oxidation rates, and you can find variations on these particular proportions as different people estimate them. If you simply go from a saturated fatty acid to an unsaturated fatty acid with one double bond, it will oxidize approximately 10 times faster. If you go to 2 double bonds, it's 100 times faster. And 3 double bonds is 150, and so on. So really, if you're frying, you want to get rid of your polyunsaturates. You want to have monounsaturates or none, or few unsaturates. What about sources of saturated fat? If we look at a few natural fats, you see palm oil, of course, palm kernel, coconut, as we mentioned. For confectionery, you've got cocoa and shea. And then, and these are tropical oils, if you like. And then in more temperate, we've got the liquid oils. And you see that the saturated fats there, without any double bonds, the C18s and the C16s, are relatively low in the liquid oils. So we're really looking at tropical fats for a source of saturated fat. Or we're looking at hydrogenating liquid oils. But consumers don't want to see hydrogenation on the label. So if we're talking about saturated fat then coming from tropical oils, there's really only one tropical oil that can provide that in any real quantity. And of course, that's palm oil. Let's skip over hydrogenation. Over the last few decades, plant breeders have been working on increasing the level of saturated fat in liquid oils. Why? Two reasons. One, by increasing the saturated fat level, you improve oxidation properties. And two, potentially you can get more structure. One of the issues is, though, that as you increase the saturated fat content of these liquid oils, you introduce the saturated, unsaturated molecule, the SOO or POO type of triglyceride. That has a melting point of around about room temperature or lower when it's in the presence of liquid oil. So it's not great for structuring. Even if you were to fractionate them, you would not end up with much that was any good for, or high yield anyway, that was any good for structuring. So there's a limit to how much they can do. And I suspect that there may be a limit in what you can do genetically with those type of plants. I think a lot of it has to do with the temperature at which seeds of those plants are germinated and grown. So if you're growing in a temperate climate, you can't afford too many saturates, otherwise the fat, the stored fat, is too hard and the seed can't make use of it to grow. So I think there's a limit there. So really we are looking at palm oil as a source of a saturated fat. So what about reasons to use palm oil then? So there's its physical chemical properties. It's rich in palmitic and oleic, and relatively high levels of POP and POO, which are ideal for getting structure. It's oxidatively stable because it has low levels of polyunsaturates. The oil yield, as we've already heard, is much higher than other seed oils. The price is competitive. There are nutritional aspects which are important in terms of the minor components that palm oil has. But there are some environmental concerns. Just looking at this is probably a very familiar chart. Because palm oil has such a broad spread of types of triglycerides, by fractionating you can produce almost any melting profile you want. And by blending with other fractions of palm oil or with other oils, you can develop a product which has exactly the properties that you're looking for in terms of its melting profile. So it's a very versatile, very adaptable oil. There's the oil yield. Some of its highest there with palm oil at 5 tons per hectare, million tons per hectare, or tons per hectare per year. Coconut is the next closest, but the other seed oils The liquid oils you see much lower. And as we've heard, as the population of the world increases and the demand for oils increases, palm oil is a logical supplier of that need. And that's prices. So palm oil is relatively high in saturated fat, but fats which are high in saturated fats are associated, or saturated fat is associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Actually, most of those studies that have been carried out look at the effect on cholesterol, which then poses the question as to whether cholesterol itself is a cause of heart disease or an indicator of heart disease. Most studies that have been done with palm oil or palm oil fractions appear to show no increased risk of cardiovascular disease, in fact, perhaps due to the mixture of saturated fat and unsaturated, monounsaturated fat that's present. Results actually on coconut oil are also ambiguous. So you can't say, although coconut oil has 86%, 90% saturates, it's bad for your heart. And there's actually still some debate over whether increase in saturated fat leads to heart disease. In fact, calorie for calorie, sugar increases your risk or raises your cholesterol more than saturated fat. We want something which is low in polyunsaturated fat, as I mentioned, because it's less susceptible to oxidation. And oxidation products have been shown to increase the plaques that you get in your blood vessels and therefore indicate heart disease. There's supposedly some mutagenic or carcinogenic radicals formed when fats oxidize as well. So we're looking to reduce polyunsaturates particularly. So palm oil is relatively high in saturated fat, low in polyunsaturated fat, so it's a good fat to actually be using. Vitamin E, there is still some tocotrienols surviving after refining, so you may lose the carotene and the orange color, but still there are antioxidants carried over into the refined oil. What about environmental concerns? This was adapted from a presentation that Eric Dumoulin did a few years ago, where he looked at the life cycle analysis of various oils. And surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, palm oil comes out much lower than liquid oils, the liquid oil. So the overall environmental impact for palm oil is much lower. And something that's really, for the last couple of decades, had an impact in the West, in Europe, it's environmental concerns, deforestation, and particularly loss of habitat for orangutans. Maybe if we had a positive image for palm oil, we could market it that way, but in Europe, people look at the orangutans and think, such wonderful creatures, lovely creatures, loss of habitat. We must stop eating palm oil because we're taking away orangutans. The message that they haven't yet, or are only just beginning to hear, is that deforestation occurs for other oils as well. That picture of deforestation there is actually in South America, where deforestation takes place on a relatively large scale to provide fields of soybeans. But there is no lobby against soybean oil in the UK and in Europe. And the story is only just starting to come out that deforestation is not just an issue for palm oil, but for other oils as well. Not only that, as with Iceland, the company declaring they're going to take palm oil out of all their products, there's an impatience with seeing control of deforestation. So I think there's quite a big marketing story to still be presented in the West as to palm oil being the solution to what you need in food products in order to provide the oxidative stability and the structure that you need in the food product. It's the highest yielding oil. It has a competitive price. It has a wide range of properties available, and environmental concerns are actually not as big as you might imagine. So with that, I'd just like to say, saturated fat is necessary. There are the marketing issues that we need to go through around the image of saturated fat, and just to say thank you very much for listening, and hopefully there's time for some questions later.